On the 20th of June 1914, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie were shot by a 19-year-old Bosnian Serb, sparking the events that would spiral out of control into the Great War. By the 30th of June, the news of the assassination of the heir of the Austro-Hungarian Empire reached Australian newspapers. No doubt there was shock, but no one thought the consequences would stretch beyond the Balkans, let alone engulf a world in fire, bullets, and blood, and mark nearly 60,000 Australian men for death and 160,000 more to be maimed. And in those morning papers on the 30th of June, little indication was made of the calamity to come. The Argus said, "The position cannot but fill the minds of European statesmen with troubled thoughts." The Sydney Morning Herald said, "The political effect of the vile crime which has inflicted yet another tragedy upon the unlucky house of the Habsburgs can yet be scarcely judged." And the Age made no comment on the situation at all, but was busy attacking the Defence Department and demanding retrenchment, stating there had been an orgy of military expenditure which was wholly unnecessary. The Australian militia and cadet force was sufficient for all contingencies. On July 4th, days after the Duke's assassination, the Age was to say, "We have no foreign armies on our borders, armed to the teeth and waiting an opportunity to spring upon us. If a handful of Boer farmers, ignorant as babes of military discipline, could withstand the whole might of the British Empire for 2 years, we can rely with perfect confidence on the services of a young nation sedulously taught for 7 years all the essentials of military craft. The cadet system is exactly what we want, and our need of any extensive and ambitious scheme is undiscernible and non-existent." Within days, the news of the incident retreated from the headlines to the back pages as a federal election campaign was underway and drought gripped the country. European concerns were just that, remote, foreign, and unimportant, all the while unaware that red threads of destiny pulled them inexorably together. And in hindsight, they may seem foolish, but rumours of war had come before and passed, and any such threats over the past had always been tempered by distance and the guaranteed strength and power of the British Navy. And as long as the fleet protected Australia and its commercial interests, Australia would remain safe and prosperous. But as July drew on, the situation rapidly changed. As Austria wanted the extinction of Serbian independence, and the news cables from the great European powers were of German forces readying and the British Navy preparing, as financial panic tore through New York. Then suddenly, Germany shattered the fragile peace and invaded Belgium on the 3rd of August 1914, and with this ending British neutrality, with the British Empire officially entering the war on the 4th of August at 11 p.m. Upon hearing word of this on the 5th of August, while Europe slept, the first shot of the British Empire would ring out from Portsea, Victoria. Australia was, for better or worse, now at war. In the words of Andrew Fisher, in rekindling the old Boer War catchcry, Australia will assist Britain to our last man and our last shilling. The outbreak of war led to a tide of patriotism that swept the nation, except for a small minority of radicals and socialists. Henry Boot of the Australian Worker was to write, "There was no great principle at stake to justify bloodshed." The Labour call was to write, "It was unthinkable to believe that because an Archduke and his missus were slain by a fanatic, the whole of Europe should become a seething battlefield, and deplorable misery brought upon the people." And there were also concerns among unionists about the dislocation of trade, particularly the end of trade to Germany, which would have significant effects on unemployment. Meanwhile, the election that was underway before the war had begun was to see Labour win a commanding majority after Joseph Cook gambled with the first federal double dissolution election to break the gridlock caused by Labour controlling the Senate. But Fisher, upon gaining power, was to be faced with the clash of empires and their colossal armies beginning to bog down into a slow grind of attrition. With only limited developments reaching the public, one thing was still clear to the new government, that the war would cost similarly colossal sums. With the Prime Minister and Treasurer, now Andrew Fisher, enacting several taxes, including the federal income tax and inheritance taxes, and working to negotiate loans from London in an attempt to finance these expenditures. Meanwhile, Hughes introduced the Enemy Contracts Annulment Act, the Trading with Enemy Act, and the very controversial WPA, War Precautions Act. And George Pearce, leading the Defence Ministry, had to arm, clothe and train the new Australian Imperial Force, or AIF, which by the end of the war was to pass 416,000 men. The stress of the war was beginning to eat away at Fisher. He was convinced German cruisers would sink Australian troopships on their way to Britain, and secretly went to New Zealand at Christmas for rest. The other thing weighing on Fisher was that the Labour caucus was brewing with turmoil, as one faction, backed by Hughes, in his view that Australia must do everything it can to assist Britain, while others in the Labour Party felt authoritarian measures would need to be brought in to facilitate this level of assistance, which would be counter to the values of the Labour Party and degrade their platform's goals, and emphasised that Australia had nothing to do with the war's origins, and doubted the wisdom of such a heavy emotional, human and financial commitment to a war so far away. This anti-war view was led by a fiery orator, Frank Anstey. He would launch an attack, stating the scalping knife and the tomahawk of the savage were humane weapons compared to those modern science had forged for this conflict. What a mockery to call this curse of war the upholding of civilization. We, the Labour Party, should take the opportunity to point out to the masses of the people that this war is the product and outcome of the domination of trade and commerce and the greed of wealth. The War Powers Act that passed in October 1914 had amendments introduced without consultation in April 1915. Many in the caucus were outraged, including Anstey and King O'Malley. Hughes was utterly dismissive, particularly of O'Malley, and was to counter saying that the war is 12,000 miles away because every day we live, thousands of men die, horrible deaths, and endure untold suffering to keep it away. But no one is to say when these pent-up forces of destruction may burst the barrier which now hedges them about, and then the war will not be 12,000 miles away, but at our very doors. The schism was only widening between camps, and Fisher was failing to mend the fray, with Anstey stating on April 29, 1915, he owed no allegiance after tonight to this government. But of course by this time, the British had tried to break the deadlock of the Western Front by opening the Dardanelles to assist the Russian Empire, their ally. Pearce was to say the news of Australia's entry into the war had simply sent Australia wild with joy. But even Fisher found getting information hard and used his friend Keith Murdoch to gather information. Murdoch would eventually write a letter with an indictment of British leadership and would contribute to the Allied withdrawal from Gallipoli. At the state levels, Labour matched its federal dominance, controlling all states except Victoria, but not all was harmonious between states and the Commonwealth. As the war had drawn on, so did the casualties rise, and as did the rise in anti-German sentiment. O'Malley attacked Hughes and Pearce over the harassment of the large German community in South Australia, and in the 1915 South Australian election, any MP that spoke out to support Germans were punished, as did all of German descent. In Queensland, Labour won a spectacular breakthrough victory off the back of Thomas Ryan, Ted Theodore and Bill McCormack. This was the most radical Labour government in the country, and they did not believe their program should wait for their war to end. Some of its key reforms would eventually be establishing state banks and destroying the Legislative Council. This program had brought the ire of many powerful interests and the Commonwealth government, who was hoping to focus all of its efforts on the war. But that tale is a story for another time. New South Wales was also proving to be rather uncooperative in loan arrangements. But the issue of getting more troops would also divide the Labour parties. The war had vast numbers of volunteers, but it was clear more would be needed, with recruitment drives underway. But not all state premiers would provide support, and now the long shadow of conscription hung over Fisher's government. But by October 30, 1915, the strain on Fisher's health had become so severe that he could no longer continue, and he resigned, and he would become the Australian High Commissioner in London, leaving all these issues to be resolved by his successor. William Billy Hughes would be his replacement. His abrasive, chaotic, but decisive and unorthodox style was a departure from Fisher's measured approach. Hughes immediately would anger his caucus by backflipping on the Labour position on the price controls referendum, which Fisher had said nothing short of an earthquake would prevent the proposals being submitted to the people. Hughes wanted to back out, thinking he would lose and it would damage his prestige, and he was quickly able to find an excuse when state premiers had objected to losing some of their powers in the referendum, and he arranged to merely borrow these powers for the duration of the war. Not long after attaining power, Hughes, not feeling he understood the war from Australia, went to England. He not only went for transparency and to argue for Australian troops, but also to tackle the problems of shipping shortages, disruption to commodities like wool, wheat, and metals, and also his suspicions of Japan's intentions could be heard by the British government. He also then went to visit the AIF in France, before the Battle of the Somme. He was deeply touched by their bravery and comradeship, and even saw a familiar face and friend, former MP Bill Johnson. The words of praise and honorary degrees Hughes was being showered with in England had reached them, and he jokingly said to him, "Well, Billy, have they made you a Doctor of Divinity yet?" He would be killed the next month at Pozières, along with 7,000 other Australians. Upon Hughes' return, after meeting with the soldiers, he was convinced Australia needed conscription to give it as strong a hand as possible to help Britain, but also to give it a better hand at the treaty negotiations. Among other things, Hughes was suspicious of Japan and their intentions to end the White Australia policy. But the anti-conscription forces had also been building too, with New South Wales, Queensland and Victorian Labor parties voting that any MP supporting conscription would not be endorsed. Hughes, to get conscription passed, had three options. One, he could pass a bill like Britain and New Zealand, but he didn't feel he had the numbers in the Senate to do this. Two, he could use the War Precautions Act to force it through, but Pearce advised such a move would be altogether distasteful and would have caused turmoil and possibly bloodshed. Thirdly, he could issue a referendum, which Hughes, believing there was strong public support, could then discipline Labour senators with. Hughes narrowly was able to convince the caucus 23-21 to support conscription, then attacked the state executives for threatening disendorsement, but was unable to convince them to reverse course. Treasurer William Higgs said of the events that the atmosphere was electrical, and a storm appears which is calculated to rend us in twain. By this time, the first Labour split was underway. On the 14th of September 1916, when Hughes moved the second reading of the military service referendum, MP for Richmond, Frank Tudor, resigned. Then New South Wales Labour, dominated by anti-conscriptionists, voted to censure their own government led by Premier Holman, who along with his ministers resigned in protest. Then the New South Wales executive voted to expel Hughes, which he promptly ignored, saying it was a matter for the Federal Parliamentary Labour Party. As the first conscription referendum campaign got underway, the blood feud deepened, with the pro-side calling the anti-side traitors and the anti-side calling the pro-side murderers. The AIF was used to break up rallies violently at times, and the government censors made anti-conscription campaigning hard. Hughes then turned the knives of his rhetoric he had previously used against enemies of the Labour movement on the anti-conscriptionists, and both sides accused each other of aligning with Japan and importing coloured labourers. Hughes then made a critical error. Assuming victory was assured, he called up men aged 21 to 35 for compulsory military training, which likely turned many against conscription, now they had had a taste of it. And then those who failed to answer the call were to be withheld from voting. One of the people that did not answer the call was future Prime Minister John Curtin, who was briefly imprisoned for this. On the 20th of October 1916, the anti-conscription vote won in a devastating shock to Hughes. Hughes said, "I look around today and see the party to which I have devoted my life hopelessly and irrevocably divided." Pearce then said, "I suppose we cannot wonder that the crisis that is shaking the world has rocked our little boat. At the next caucus meeting, on November 14, a no-confidence motion was moved. Then anti-conscriptionist James Katz launched into a heated anti-Hughes tirade. Hughes himself stayed cool, continuing to smoke his cigarette. Then he stood, raised a hand, extinguished his cigarette, and said enough of this, and said all of those of the same view as him on the war follow him. As he marched out to a Senate club room, Hughes then formed a new National Labour Ministry comprised of 25 defectors, while 46 remained. Hughes then would enter a coalition with the non-Labour parties, creating the Nationalist Party. Hughes then used a series of dubious tricks to engineer a Senate majority to avoid an election. He was successful in creating the majority, but had so disturbed some of his caucus members they did not vote to delay the election, and the details of which would be the subject of a royal commission. The subsequent May 5th, 1917 election would see the Nationalists win a landslide and see O'Malley among the losses. The sweeping of Labour from office continued around the country. The Labour movement's frustrations, both political and industrial, boiled over into a general strike, which was broken up. Many did not find their jobs waiting for them, including Ben Chifley, who was propelled into politics by this incident. The second conscription referendum was a heated contest to say the least. The most interesting story from these events was in Queensland, where T.J. Ryan's Labour government still reigned supreme and despised Hughes for his betrayal of the Labour movement, and would be very critical of Hughes, the war, and the censorship imposed under the War Precautions Act. To circumvent censorship of his message critical of conscription, he delivered a speech in Parliament and then printed copies of the Hansard record. This was met with Hughes ordering a raid on the officers that were printing these. Then when Hughes went to Queensland to speak at a pro-conscription rally, he was egged. Hughes then jumped into the crowd and had, luckily for the perpetrators, forgotten his pistol. Hughes was so angered by T.J. Ryan and Queensland's police not prosecuting the perpetrators, he created what is now known as the Australian Federal Police, or the AFP. In the end, though, the second referendum would again be beaten after a vote on the 20th December 1917. The war ended on the 11th of November 1918. By that time, it's estimated that Australia had sent 340,000 members of the armed forces overseas. 213,000 soldiers were battle casualties, with 54,000 dead and 155,000 wounded. With the war now over, the outbreak of Spanish flu was a cause for concern and meant that soldiers were stuck on quarantine ships for extended periods, making them restless. And while they were waiting to be repatriated, training for civilian work began for many. Another example of soldier unrest was on Peace Day. Peace Day was a day that was declared by the British Empire on the 19th of July 1919. In Melbourne, this would take the form of celebratory marches through the city. These would eventually turn violent and become the Peace Day riots, after 2 soldiers were arrested for improper conduct and remanded at Town Hall. Some soldiers, upon learning this, charged the Town Hall and demanded their release, then proceeded, after the police tried to reason with them, to hurl stones and bottles at them. The riots culminated with a group of AIF soldiers storming the Treasury and throwing an inkwell at the Premier's head, leaving him with a cut on his forehead. As a result of this unrest, the process of repatriation was vital, not just for economic reasons and the feeling of indebtedness to soldiers, but also the need to stabilize a society so dislocated by war and needing to return to normalcy. Due to this need of repatriation, the War Gratuities Act of 1920 granted returned nurses, soldiers, and next of kin payments, which were pushed for by the Returned Sailors and Soldiers Imperial League, on top of the War Services Homes, Pensions and Land Settlement Scheme, and with the timing of the 1919 election, allowed them to push for this outcome in an obvious transaction for the soldiers' vote. Hughes was able to reach a deal, but to limit the immediate expense, the gratuity wasn't paid in cash, but in bonds. In his words, "I am not Aaron, I cannot make the rock gush by merely striking it." The repayments would be 25 million in bonds, 7 to 15 million of which was hoped to come from German reparations. Labour alternatively promised to give grants in cash. But given the sheer infeasibility of this was soundly beaten in the 1919 election, allowing Hughes to reign ascendant over his enemies in the Labour Party and lead the country until a group of discontented farmers and rural interests finally formed a party tipped over the edge by his interfering policies of World War I that would wrest his grip from power, who would come to be critical in shaping the direction of the Commonwealth Bank towards central banking. They would be the Country Party, now known as the Nationals, and would be led by Earl Page. But their story is for another time. As the war drew on, the human costs were mounting, causing all sorts of political consequences, as detailed above. But to arm, feed, clothe, train, and transport the RAF to war was becoming evidently expensive in a way previously thought inconceivable. The costs would exceed £460 million after 4 years of war. The final cost of the war for Australia alone to the end of the 1919-20 financial year would be approximately £377 million. When repatriations, gratuities, and pensions were added, it came to costs of £831 million by the end of the 1933-34 financial year. When measured against previous wars, like the Napoleonic Wars, which were estimated to cost Britain £621 million in 1815, or the Crimean War, which was between 1854 and 1856, cost an average of £78 million a year for a nation of 27 million people, whereas Australia was just 5. To finance this war, Australia had had no previous experience on this scale, and even Britain had to go back a century before to the Napoleonic Wars for its references. The first part of attempting to solve this financial problem involved bringing the private banks under partial government controls. This brought significant business to the government's banker, the Commonwealth Bank, which would control and organise war loans and finance. It would also largely take over the role of notes distribution. This is not printing notes, which is still a treasury power at this time, although Governor Miller is already secretly drawing up plans to do so, expecting the notes issuance to be given to him. Rather, what the bank did was it exchanged notes for gold. During the war, notes became vitally important for trade as gold all but ceased to circulate. The government issued an emergency notes issuance. The banks could then use them in exchange for gold. The exchange was one sovereign would give them 3 Australian pounds. One of those pounds would be given in exchange for the gold sovereign, as the value of £1 equals 1 sovereign. The other £2 would be treated as a loan, which they would have to pay interest on. This arrangement was referred to as the 3-for-1 and would last until the end of the war. The reason notes became so important was the government practically ended convertibility of gold. Notes used to say they would pay the bearer the specified amount in gold on demand at the Commonwealth Treasury at the seat of government. This meant outside of Melbourne, where the federal government and the Treasury used to be, getting gold was not possible, and if you did live in Melbourne, they would question you and generally deny you access. Despite this, the Treasury still kept notes issuance within its 25% gold ratio requirements, but practically had left the gold standard as gold exports had now been banned, meaning the automatic stabilizer of the exchange rate was prevented from working. The ability of Australia to stay on a stable reserve ratio to gold is a result of reserves increasing just as rapidly as notes did, thanks to Australia still being a large producer of gold and the banks trading much of its gold for notes. Before the outbreak of war, note circulation was around £9.6 million. By June 1915, it was £32 million, and by October 1918, it was £59.7 million. Earl Page was to say, reminiscing on this in 1924, "Immediately upon the outbreak of war, the banks brought large sums of gold to the Treasury to be exchanged for equivalent sums in notes. Their actions were quite voluntary, and the result of a natural desire to stock their numerous branches with more convenient paper money. Thus began a strengthening of the gold reserves of the Treasury." This rapid increase in money supply was answered in kind with phenomenal inflation. While estimates vary, one estimate put the price level at 1913 of 100 and then by 1920 it rose to 247. A problem that could have arisen was that if a bank needed to get British pounds in normal business times, it would sell Australian pounds, and if unable to, it would export gold. But now there was an embargo on gold exports. This, however, was not to be a problem, as exports more broadly remained strong, so the balance of payments were not an issue, and an arrangement between the Bank of England and the Commonwealth Bank allowed advances to be made based on gold reserves rather than physical transfers. With the currency and exchange problems now controlled for, the main problem for the government was to think about how the war would be paid for. Would it be paid for through income or debt? Fisher had introduced income taxes and other taxes, hoping to finance solely through revenue. This optimism was not backed by the hard facts, with customs and excise revenue staying mostly stable, and new tax revenue proving insufficient for the rapacious and seemingly bottomless hunger of the war machine. It was with great reluctance, Fisher acknowledged, that I gave up the cherished hope of financing our war forces on sea and land, in the Pacific and in Europe, during this financial year from revenue. But that wish had to be sacrificed in order that we might be able to render needed financial help to the states. A key problem was the Commonwealth government had never issued public bonds before, and the states financed largely in London markets. Fisher wanted to raise all the money through the Commonwealth, then distribute it to the states as needed. At the start of the war, the federal government debt was very low at around £19 million, and most of these had been assumed state debts after Federation. But state debt was much higher at around £318 million, and the states expected to keep financing public works projects through loans, leaving the British and Commonwealth government's calls for state cuts to public spending, particularly public works, unheeded. Joseph Cook was the first to try and solve these funding problems with a Premier's Conference in Melbourne in early August of 1914. The conference recognised the federal government's need to focus on the war, as well as the desirability of getting funds for public works, something the British government would repeatedly point out is not possible. Fisher, when elected, found the financial position most unsatisfactory and committed to the Premiers that the Commonwealth was not in a position to finance the necessary money to finance the states together with its own war and other expenditures, without resorting to the London money market. But the problem that Fisher had seen, as well as Joseph Cook, was that the London money market was not easy to access, with the Chancellor of the Exchequer, equivalent to Britain's Treasurer, strongly objecting to loans for public works, and the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Lloyd George, saying, "How can the Commonwealth Government expect to recruit by voluntary enlistment if the states spend millions upon public works which will give profitable employment to thousands of men who ought to enlist?" Fisher would then ask the British government for permission to float a £20 million bond issue, which they would not allow since they had already refused similar requests from within Britain, but did allow for them to float an £18 million Imperial War Bond. Fisher would then call a conference of the Premiers again in November of 1914 and divide this money amongst them. This, however, was not a viable long-term strategy, particularly with the British government issuing a now official rule for all dominions around loans from London in March of 1915. Only 3 types of loans would be approved: loans for war, for completing current public works projects, and money for loan conversions. It would outright refuse any loans for new public works projects, as it had cut back public works itself. In the first year, the war was proving to be more expensive than the Commonwealth had thought, with total loans for all levels exceeding £51 million. A key problem for Fisher was that the British had been treating all 7 Australian governments differently, and this had been affecting their credit. Fisher wanted to unite them so they could negotiate on better terms for loans. New South Wales would refuse his pleas, but the other states would agree, and they jointly applied for a £25 million loan, which would be heavily scrutinised by the British government, while New South Wales quickly got its £2 million loan. The British government half seriously recommended they go to New York for funds. Fisher didn't want this, as he wanted to keep British ties strong and wanted to curb the state's spending. New South Wales did finally end its intransigence in July of 1918, long after it could have been of any use. The Commonwealth government may have been more able to discipline the states to cut spending on public works if it had led by example, which it most certainly did not, with spending on public works, particularly the transcontinental rail line, becoming prodigious. But Fisher was to find that he was wrong to think London was the only place he could raise funds, and Fisher would turn to the Commonwealth Bank to help float war loans in Australia. On July 1st, 1915, Fisher in a speech appealed to Australian patriotism and self-interest for loans. But still there was some fear and uncertainty as to how much would realistically be raised. These concerns were to be unfounded, with the first war bond issue aiming for £5 million at 4.5% interest rate, but ended up being subscribed for £13.4 million, with 18,748 persons subscribing. They also found raising loans domestically was far cheaper than doing so in London. Denison Miller, the governor of the Commonwealth Bank, was to say, "So far as my information goes, it will compare favourably with any loan that has ever been issued by the British or any other government." The wild success of the loan was a triumph for the bank, and Miller noted with satisfaction that it had brought the Commonwealth Bank into great prominence, and that it was a stupendous achievement of Australian patriotism. In total, 7 war loans and 3 peace loans were to be raised, with £210 million asked for and £250 million raised, with 834,000 applicants and a cost of flotation at £706,000. The terms of the first 5 war bond issues were at 4.5% and would be free from the new income taxes. The 6th loan would be the same, but you could get 5% if you subject it to income tax. By the 7th and 8th loan, they had removed the option of an income tax exemption, and by the 9th and 10th loans, the rate had been raised to 6%. On top of this, £7.4 million were raised through a method called war certificates, a popular form of financing in Britain. The scheme was introduced in 1917, where compound interest was applied at 5% for 3 years up to values of £1,000. The early loan campaigns used simple methods like newspaper ads, notice boards at post offices and banks. But in enticing the public to subscribe to ever greater amounts, by the 6th campaign it was felt much more was needed. In the 6th war loan campaign, they used an actual tank which had been imported from Great Britain to lumber through streets with wicked-looking guns protruding from its slate-coloured armour. Planes would swoop and discharge a sackful of little printed leaflets commending the war loan, the paper flakes so great it suggested a snowstorm. At Martin Place in Sydney, a model warship was manned and guarded by the Blue Jackets, with people proselytising from the deck to subscribe to the 7th war loan, with a fluttering Union Jack beamed above them. And in cities across the country, barometers were set up with their state's financing goals at the top of a barometer. The barometer had hands like a clock that would move towards the goal as money came in, with officials appealing to the people to help move the hand. Even with all this extra excitement and campaigning enthusiasm, by the 7th war bond, the government had begun issuing threats, which would prove unnecessary, as the Commonwealth government would once again underestimate the will of the Australian people to support its soldiers. But as the 7th war loan approached, Treasurer Watt, on September 25, 1918, signalled new legislation to compel war contributions proportional to their means. Watt was to say, while relying in the past upon the patriotic spirit of the people to furnish the major portion of our loan supplies voluntarily, it has been determined that in so far as subscriptions to any war loan fall short of the amount required, resort must be made to compulsion. The second reading of the War Loan Subscriptions Bill made clear on the 9th of October, on the eve of the 7th War Loan flotation, with the provision that every person to subscribe to any war loan a sum equal in any given year to 6 times his yearly average income tax paid during the previous 3 years. Still, there was some anxiety that the loan would be undersubscribed, but in the end the loan was oversubscribed, with £44 million of loans being subscribed to. After the war, 3 peace loans would be floated. These were needed to raise money for repatriation of soldiers, and similar levels of enthusiasm were needed to be generated, as incomes post-war had dropped, and the war ending had reduced interest. The other function the Commonwealth Bank was tasked with was financing the export trade. Before the war, products were handled by merchants and brokers, but the war disrupted shipping, and so too did it disrupt the means of payment and British demand for products. By 1915, it was clear action was needed. The solution was farmers could sell their products into pools at a set price, and they would arrange the sale and transport of the goods. The solution was farmers could sell into pools at a set price. The products would then be arranged for sale and the goods transported. The government would then work with the merchants and the Commonwealth Bank, whose role was to finance this. Wheat was the first good to be controlled by government prohibition of exports. State governments purchased the 1914-15 harvest as a temporary measure, but in a spring meeting in Melbourne, they created a new arrangement given an impending large harvest was on its way, but there was clearly insufficient ships to export it, and so a scheme was devised which would last until the end of the 1920-21 financial year. It involved the creation of an interstate wheat board composed of the Prime Minister and Ministers of Agriculture for Victoria, New South Wales, Western Australia, and South Australia. Essentially, this board would pool the harvest, then it would sell it when shipping was available, preventing a rush to sell Australian stock so that a particular merchant could unload his stock at the expense of the market and therefore crash prices. The states would buy the wheat using negotiable certificates at a set price, and the surplus price above the pool price would then be given to the farmers. Banks agreed to advance the money necessary to cash in these certificates at a rate proportional to their market share of deposits in a given state. So in New South Wales, the Bank of New South Wales had a 37% market share and would handle 37% of the business related to the wheat pool. The Commonwealth Bank, on the other hand, had 4% of the deposits and so would manage 4% of the business of the wheat pools. It wasn't until the 1916-17 financial year that the Commonwealth Bank would be given a unique role, and it would arrange the quotas for banks and make adjustments between the banks, and would in London distribute to the banks sums received from the sale of wheat there. Wool, another major market to the Australian economy, was not as quickly controlled, except for the export bans to Germany and other Triple Alliance nations. But Miller was from the outset concerned that the exit of these major buyers from the market would crash the price, and the full clip of wool would go unsold. He then proposed to the Governor-General, Sir Ronald Munro Ferguson, that Britain should buy all unsold wool and stockpile it here if there was no immediate need, and proposed the Commonwealth Bank advance 50% of the wool's value per shipment based on 1913 prices. The British government did not take up the offer, but did pay out £9 million of debts British manufacturers had been owed by Germans, so they could buy up Australian wool. However, by the end of 1916, Britain's government agreed to buy the whole value of the wool clip and did so for the next 4 years. This money paid was based on the value the Central Wool Committee in Melbourne informed them of. This money was then given to the Commonwealth Bank in London, and the bank would then split the money the same way it had done for the wheat pool. Between 1916 and 1920, the amount Britain paid for wool was £173 million. Similar schemes to the wheat and wool pools were introduced to fix the prices and manage the exports of other goods, including meat, sugar, and dairy products. Another thing to consider was not just the finance, but the transporting of these goods, as most ships had been compulsorily acquired for the war effort. As hinted at before, Hughes, upon taking up the Prime Ministership, was annoyed by this lack of shipping and sought to buy ships with or without the permission of the British government, and in aid of this goal, Dennis and Miller arranged for £3.5 million to meet him there to carry this out. Upon arrival, however, he quickly handed a bundle of papers to Campion, the manager of the London branch of the Commonwealth Bank, and left him to buy the ships as he left for France. Campion was rather annoyed by this, but bought the 15 ships, and Hughes was then able to convince the British government to let them keep them. As for the savings bank's activities during the war, the bank had to establish branches for soldiers and opened in military camps. The bank would allow telegraphs at no cost to soldiers and handled 268,000 transfers, at around £3.5 million until 1920. The bank at this time, however, still did not have good relationships with London, particularly the military. By the end of 1916, all of the bank's London staff had been conscripted. These had to be replaced with old men and women as temporary clerks. When the bank had sought exemptions, they had been denied. Fisher, though now as High Commissioner, was able to get 10 staff exempted. Women were important, but Miller made it clear they were to be used only for specialised tasks, not general work. Also during the war, South Australia transferred its business to the Commonwealth Bank, and the Sydney head office had been completed, opening on the 22nd of August 1916. By 1918, the Commonwealth Savings Bank had attained 14% of total deposits, now 33.5 million, the second highest in the country, although its business loans were only 6% share at £9 million, the seventh largest. With the war now over, the bank had to transfer the accounts that it had opened for Australian soldiers back to their old banks. As made clear earlier, soldiers after the war were to be given payments and war service houses. The Commonwealth Bank was to be in charge of paying these payments to these soldiers and also financing the housing of these soldiers. Under the 1918 War Service Homes Act and its subsequent 1919 and 1920 amendments, a commissioner was appointed to provide homes for returned servicemen, nurses, and munitions workers. The commissioner had wide powers to buy land or houses, or to build houses. Initially, limits on advances were £700, but were then raised to £800 as costs rose. The rate on these loans were 5%, and the bank was considered as the agent to the commissioner. The bank was empowered to purchase, sell land, erect houses, and loan money. By the end of this program, the bank had bought 5,179 houses at £2.9 million. The bank would also erect 1,777 houses at a cost of £1.7 million. At the end of the war, the bank had gained the great prominence and respect Dennis and Miller had hoped for, and Andrew Fisher had been proven right in wanting some form of banking institution to help the government get finance. But the onerous wartime controls of the economy would have widely felt political and economic consequences in the decade ahead, as the bank finally begins to make the move from a state bank solely to being more of a central bank. But that will be a story for another time.